Hey Dave, I'm glad I caught you. I'm just on my way to the blueberry fields to hang up these osmia nesting blocks as it's just pollination time, and I thought you might be able to tell the folks listening to this a little bit about blueberry production.
Okay, sure. Well, wild blueberries is a rather unique crop in that it's managed from wild stands. When the settlers first came over in the 1800s, they found these large glacial whitewash plains that had blueberry plants in them. They had been burned over by the Native Americans. And shipbuilding industry came in and cleared out a lot of the trees, and together with the burning, they had a very large area that produced our native wild blueberry plants. The industry has since grown over the years. We now produce about 90 million pounds of wild blueberries in Maine. The crop is unique in that it has a 2-year cycle. The first year is pruning and vegetative growth, and the next year is flowering and fruiting. And from that flowering part, it's very important that we have pollinators. Now that we've increased the management practices by controlling the weeds, the insects, we're producing a lot more plants, and we need to supplement the native pollinators with honeybees coming in.
So one thing I understand now is that in any given year now, over 70,000 colonies of honeybees are brought into Maine for blueberry pollination.
That's correct. We have the second largest state for the utilization of bees. Each hive produces about 1,000 pounds per acre, and before we began bringing these bees in, our crop was only about 20 million pounds. And with each of the hives, we can increase the production at least 1,000 pounds an acre, honeybees.
Because really, without the bees, there's no fruit at all. Isn't that right? That they're totally dependent on honeybees.
Right. Well, I say
native bees.
No bees, no blueberries. So that's correct. We have to have either native bees or honeybees. There's certainly not a lot of native bees out there. The bumblebees, the osmia leaf-cutting bees, and the halictid sweat bees. So they do have some background pollination, but without those supplemental hives, we can't get the yields that we need to get.
Well, as Dave said, it's a really interesting crop, and it's quite unique. And I'm going to take you out to some blueberry fields very shortly. But what's always magnificent to me is that none of these plants were planted, that they're just native plants in the understory of the forest, and when they clear cut the forest, then they slowly fill in if you can eliminate the competing other weeds and trees. Well, thanks a lot, Dave.
Sure.
It's very interesting. Yep. And then over here we can see we have what looks like a single patch of blueberries, but actually this is 4 individual plants. And each patch that has the same color of leaves or the same tint of flowers is a single individual plant.
Wow, then you mean that these flowers over here, they're a little bit taller and kind of lighter green, they're a different plant?
They're a different plant with the light green leaves than this one right here that has much more of a reddish green leaf, which is very different than these plants way at the other end here that have a very, very white flower and red and green leaves. One thing though that they all share in common is that, for instance, this bumblebee over here actually has to take pollen from this individual plant and bring it over to this individual plant. And this is called cross-pollination, and it's an obligatory characteristic of blueberries that they need to have pollen from other individuals.
So pollen from these plants could not produce a fruit in these plants?
There are a few individuals, about 20% of all the individual plants out here, that can actually self-fertilize themselves. But 80% of all the individuals have to have pollen from another individual plant.
Well, that's amazing. And then you could potentially get a blueberry set for each one of these flowers?
That's right. And there's on average, about 8,000 flowers per square yard.
8,000.
So the potential for blueberries to be produced is quite high if there are enough pollinators that move pollen you can see that they'll visit several flowers within close distance, and then they'll take a flight which might be several meters away, and that kind of behavior maximizes the chance that they bring pollen from one plant to another, one clone to another.
How many native bees do you think you have that visit these blueberries?
You mean numbers of species of bees?
Yeah.
Yeah, so far we've recorded 134 different species.
Wow.
Okay, well, one thing that's maybe different from a lot of other crops is because these blueberries aren't planted and there's a continuous mat of blueberries that weeds can colonize, and there's really no way to cultivate them out.
So these are basically wild plants.
Yes, so this is white birch, and some of the cherries you can see on the very edge are in full flower, and those plants are actually a boon to the pollinators because they provide flowers just a little before the blueberries come into bloom.
Right on the edge of this forest. So you mean there may be blueberries underneath this forest canopy over here?
There are definitely blueberries underneath that forest canopy, and so if that was cut back, the farmer could increase the size of the blueberries that are being managed. And so these trees right here can be a problem if they're not managed, and so traditionally farmers used to burn the field after they harvested it to keep out the competitive species like many of these trees that colonize.
That wouldn't hurt the blueberries?
Doesn't hurt the blueberries at all. They're adapted to fire. Nowadays, more and more farmers are using herbicides that are selective and don't harm the growth of the blueberries but kill a lot of the trees that come in. Okay, so John, you can see that once we get outside of the boundaries of the field and into the edge, you can see that there are still blueberries growing on the edge here.
Right.
And then in addition, there are a lot of the forest species which offer forage to many of the native bees, such as this cherry. This is what's called a half-high. This is a cross between highbush and lowbush.
Yes.
So there must be some highbush back in here somewhere, especially where it gets wetter. This field gets quite wet over here.
Frank, do these blueberries grow in the forest?
They do. They're actually the natural understory, and you can see right at the edge of the forest there's still flowers being produced. But as we look deeper in the forest, there's still the blueberries growing low to the ground, but they no longer have any flowers anymore. But they're perfectly fine, and they'll survive year to year for many, many years like that, but they just won't produce flowers.
There's too much shade?
Too much shade. About a reduction of 20% of the light will prevent flowers from being produced. These black cherries that we've been looking at can make up a considerable amount of forage for these bees. And in a field like this that's deciduous, they serve as a good characteristic of a field that has high bee abundance. And as we move to fields that are surrounded by coniferous forest, pines and spruces, we don't find all of these floral resources for the bees.
So they get both nectar and pollen from these black cherry?
They do. Okay. So, John, one common characteristic of blueberry fields is that they're on very shallow soil, and most of the soil is overlaying shattered bedrock like this. And so these plants are well adapted for drought and highly acidic, poor nutrition soils.
Wow, that's amazing that they would grow in this kind of thin soil.
Yeah, they have a very shallow root system. These soils in this part of the state you can see that they're much more of a very heavy, silty soil, and they're quite rich in nutrients compared to the blueberry soils in the major blueberry growing area in the state, which are granitic, sandy soils, really mostly gravelly glacial outwash, whereas these ones on the hillsides and mountainsides are a very rich, nutritious, silty soil with some clay underneath. And so this provides a very different environment and holds more moisture for the blueberry plants, but it also allows competing weeds to become established and be more of a problem. These soils also tend not to support the solitary soil nesting bees in as high densities as the more sandy soils that are quite a bit drier and provide a better environment for the bee larvae under the ground.
Do you think, are they more compacted?
They're much more compacted and stay very moist and can be saturated with water, which the bees really can't tolerate.
So they need well-drained soils.
Yes. Now some blueberry fields are consistently high-producing fields, and much of this is due to pollinators, but some of it can be due to the spring climate. And this particular field has never been a very consistent, good yielding field, and that's because you can see this slope. It's on a north-facing slope, and so this field quite often gets frosted in the spring during bloom. And so the farmer that manages this field really takes a lot of risk, and so he tends not to put in a lot of inputs to enhance yield here. And this is why there are actually no honeybees that have been brought in to pollinate this field, because it's a very risky field and it may not produce fruit at all if there's a frost. Yeah, so this is the division between these two clones, and for the most part, when clones grow vegetatively and then they come in contact with one another, then it forms a border and there's not that much intrusion of one clone into the other. They tend to recognize that they're two individuals and they stop expanding vegetatively at that point, and then put more energy into flower production. And this heterogeneity amongst the plants, having all these different clones, creates a lot of genetic diversity and differences in the plants, which means that blueberries, relative to a lot of other crops, have very few insect pests and diseases that have large explosive outbreaks and threaten the crop. And it's because of this genetic diversity that slows the rate of spread of these pests through the crop. And so this crop really does not get treated with that many insecticides, fungicides to control these pests, although there are some pesticides that are used. And if we step just over here, we see some symptoms of a disease called mummyberry disease, where we have these necrotic leaves. And this is a very interesting disease because the fungus kills the leaves and then spores will be produced, but in addition, the fungus secretes a sugary substance which attracts the bees to it. And as they imbibe the sugary substance, they pick up the fungal spores. And then when they visit flowers, the bees inoculate the flowers with this fungus, and it kills the flowers and results in lower yield. And I think we talked a little bit about this, that blueberries are grown and cultivated on an every other year basis. And so in the far distance, that reddish brown landscape are the blueberry fields that are growing vegetatively this year and will produce flower buds for next year and be harvested next year. Right in the foreground right here is the flowering crop, which will produce berries this year. And after the berries are harvested, then they will be mown to the ground, and next year they will grow vegetatively. And so these fields flip back and forth every other year between flowering or vegetative growth. And so it's a culture that's maximizes the numbers of flowers and fruit that are produced on a square acre basis. Yeah, so these bare soil areas are areas where at one time there were competing weedy species, and selective herbicides that don't harm the blueberries have been applied here to kill the competing weeds, and then slowly over time the blueberries will grow together and this bare spot will disappear. But these bare spots in the meantime can be quite beneficial to pollination because they provide optimal habitats for soil nesting solitary bees that will build up populations in these areas and then pollinate the blueberry plants. So one of the characteristics that we mentioned of these glacial outwash plains is this very sandy, gravelly soil. And one quality of this soil relative to pollination and bees is that these areas are very good habitats for nesting, for solitary andrenid and halictid bees. So the digger bees and the sweat bees make nests here. And here you can see where this more tan soil has been brought up from below, and there are actually some soil nesting bee holes here where my finger is. And in this one small area here, there looks like there's about 30 soil nesting bees. Here's another nesting area right here, this hole right here. And so we have about 35 different species of these soil nesting sand bees or andrenid bees that occupy the blueberry barrens and other areas throughout Maine that are found nesting within the blueberry fields. Okay, well, we've just been in commercial blueberry fields, and what we're looking at here is an area that is a commercial blueberry field to be in the future. The forest has been clear cut, and this big excavator in the background is pulling out boulders and also yanking out the root systems of the large trees that were cut down. If you come with me, we'll take a walk over here and we'll look at the evidence that there are blueberry plants in the understory of these forests that will now be the foundation of the new blueberry field. So why don't we walk over here? And so there are a lot of shrubs here, but these small stems and twigs are the Vaccinium angustifolium, which will be the blueberry plants in the future. And they will grow and fill in this entire landscape, so it will be a mat of blueberry plants as is seen across the road behind us. And so this is sort of the creation of a new field without planting blueberry plants. It involves, again, just cutting down the forest and cleaning out the stumps, removing the large boulders, and then encouraging blueberry growth by eliminating competing weed species by burning and then also the use of herbicides. And this will be a very productive blueberry field in about 15 to 20 years. But in about 5 years, the first few blueberries will appear and there'll be limited harvesting in this field.